Hello. So I'm just going to jump straight in. So if you've studied a game design course, you might have seen this game before. This is called Senate, and it's an Egyptian game, and it's one of the oldest games we know about. It's so old, we don't know the proper rules. So, a board game. When I play board games, it feels like I'm reading in hieroglyphics anyway. So, a hieroglyphic of the game has been found as far back as 1300 BC. So games in Africa go way back. This is a game called Maraba Raba. This is a game played in all over southern Africa and has been played for millennia on the continent. It is still played. It's still played actively today with competitions, leagues, and digital conversions running amok. I have a hobby where I love collecting games, photos of games happening in seemingly mundane and extraordinary moments. So this is a photo of a group of men playing Maraba Raba during the Sophiatown removals, which is one of the South African apartheid regime's many enforcements of separating the races in South Africa. Sophiatown was a hub for black arts and culture, producing artists such as Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba. The removals were one of the major haunting upsets to black culture during apartheid, of which there were many. And yet, here are three men playing a game they've been playing since childhood, unfazed by forced removals around them. I'm still not sure if the graffiti is related to the game or not, because if you played Maraba Raba, you can get quite upset. So, who knows? But the point here is games are part of African traditions. They're in Africa's blood. So, just to get back to me quickly, I'm Ben Myres, creative director of a South African/Kenyan game studio, Nyamacorp, and I make games with your boy, as some of you might know him, the handsome Shakir Sugar Kamani. And we're making this game, a Play-Doh platformer where you can deform the platforms in the world. But I don't want to talk too much about that. I'm also the program manager for Myres Johannesburg, which is a smaller event in Johannesburg that works within the same framework. It's such a crucial event for games in Africa because it's done two things over its 5 years. The first is that it's the only international and regional event that regularly exhibits and curates games from around Africa, showing the best and most important works on the continent, just like in Berlin. The second important thing is the festival is the only event that regularly creates a bridge between African and international game developers. And both these two things have been really impactful on the African game scene, supporting game developers to meet each other within Africa and outside of Africa, and it's had quite a big impact. Because I have been involved in the festival so long, I've got to know a lot about African games at a level I don't think many people know about, at a sort of like high level. These are the sort of other people I've met from around the continent, via digitally or in person. So you should follow them if you want to know more about their respective game scene. They do amazing work. But now I just want to jump into basically taking a whirlwind tour through Africa to cover some design movements that are coming out of the continent from creators. So we start in northern Africa, which, like many places in Africa, is a sort of liminal space. It has ties to the Arabic world, so often it's excluded from the rest of Africa with the term sub-Saharan Africa. It's one of the few areas in the continent that has had some sort of AAA influence. Ubisoft Casablanca was one of the only AAA game studios on the continent for its 11 years that it ran, until it closed down a year or two ago, which has been really good for the Casablanca game scene, of course, because now there's all these really talented game developers running around. Particularly in Tunisia and Morocco, you can really feel the influence of that AAA background. They have a small collection of studios, and the games there have pretty high polish and mostly pretty high standard mechanics. Both these games don't necessarily look that African, and that's partially, I think, because of that AAA background. They've been making games that are, for the West and not necessarily for their own communities. But the region is wonderfully creative and talented. Morocco in particular, part of those creators have started taking that AAA background and begin using it to create locally themed but amazingly polished works. 7 a.m. is another Subway Surfer clone, which you'll see a lot of in this talk. But this time it's set in the bustling cities of Morocco. Rangi VR is a Gear VR game with beautiful Moroccan architecture, and apparently yesterday was announced as one of the few games that's going to launch with the platform. The region also has a series of game jams happening very regularly, particularly in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, which they often collaborate with other Arabic countries further to the north. These game jams, like many, are producing promising and innovative mechanical games. The game to the left is a sort of illusion, desert, and architecture game, while the bottom right is Lantern of Truth, which is a surrealist game about lanterns and space usage. These GIFs are very slow. It happens. But developers in the region also have very political motives. Particularly in Egypt, the creators are starting to branch out. They create very mechanical works, but are also starting to create very political, social, and personal games. The game up top here is made by an Egyptian developer who now studies his PhD at NYU and grapples with his identity as a homosexual man from an Arabic region, while the game in the bottom right is about Egyptian marriage ritual. So these sort of like creative, personal games are starting to come out of Northern Africa. But now quickly we'll move on to Central Africa. There's not that much happening in this region that we know of yet, mostly because the region has been struck by a war and disaster in recent decades. There are, however, a few developers doing amazing things there, and they represent a broader trend over a lot of the rest of Africa. The region is primarily concerned with diverse representation. Creators in Africa don't often get to see and play games that have Black African people in them. And when they do, often they are just enemies that need to be dealt with rapidly. Creators learn to love video games through the avatars of people that aren't like them and don't tell their stories. So when they become able to create games, the very first things they try and do are make games with people like them. So, as we see in Angola, this is a game called Zangueira, which follows in the country iconic female informal entrepreneurs in Angola, and is a Subway Surfer clone. There is a math mini-game that happens when you run into customers, but for the most part it's a pretty head-on mechanical clone. In Angola, the government is trying to fine these vendors who are part of a massive informal market $270 each time they're found, which is about 2 months' worth of profit. So this story is a mechanical clone, but it tells a very personal thematic story to the people in Angola. A work that is continuing on that is a mammoth achievement in diverse representation is called Orion. It is an African fantasy RPG, which has been made over a decade with various different versions, dozens of employees, and an immense amount of press. Even the Wall Street Journal wrote about this game. The game is more mechanically unique than most games coming out of Central Africa, but still focuses heavily on better representation. The game, from the beginning, aims to tell a uniquely African story, basing the narrative in the world in Cameroonian and African fantasy and myth. The scale of this achievement as a game is so important for the movement of African representation and proves what African creators can do. And then we'll move on quickly to Western Africa. I won't talk too much about a lot of countries in Western Africa just for the interest of time, but it's important to point out that there's a company there called Leti Arts, which is based in Ghana and is the first black-owned and one of the first black-owned and developed studios in Africa, running formally since 2009, but informally way before then. Their games prominently feature African content and characters, particularly trying to create a collection of African superheroes that are based in myths and legends from all over the continent. But the country I really want to talk about in Western Africa is Nigeria, which is a wonderfully amazing and edgy country, overflowing with culture and entrepreneurial drive that few other countries anywhere in the world can match. It makes sense that such a large country has such a vibrant game development scene. And for almost all of the developers in the country, mobile is king. They don't even consider making games for PC or console. That is because of the importance of mobile on the continent. Computers and fixed internet are very expensive, so many Africans run their whole lives from phones, from banking to, even if they're entrepreneurs, point-of-sale systems. Thus, for Nigerian game developers, mobile is the only thing that makes sense to create for. That's what Nigerians are using to live their lives. Interestingly, though, sometimes much of these games' audience aren't actually people in Nigeria. Instead, the large African diaspora of Nigerians in the West consumes and pays for these games. For a moment, I just want to talk about how Nigerian game developers attempt to monetize, because it's an interesting example that affects the games they make. These games are usually free to download or play because players can't usually afford to spend money on games. For many Nigerians as well, buying a phone is the first piece of technology they have in their family, or they have no built-up history of how to use phones, computers. That means they have no idea how to download and buy games. So some Nigerian game developers have come up with alternative ways to get their games out there. This is Computer Village in Lagos, this massive market in the center of Lagos, and it's the largest ICT accessory market in the whole of Africa. Nigerian game developers go directly to the vendors in this market and pay them to put their games directly on the phone. So when someone buys a phone from these vendors, their game's already on it. And that's the way some Nigerian game developers do business. But there are other problems that Nigerian game developers face. Again, many of these phones they're buying aren't necessarily smartphones like all of us use. They're feature phones, sort of those old school 90s phones we think of. That means the technology you're working with is much lower. So the games can be quite bare and simple. Also, additionally, internet data can be excruciatingly expensive in Africa. So downloading large, complex games just isn't feasible for a lot of people. So some of these developers partner with the cell phone networks to download the games through USSD and use airtime to buy the games. It's very, very different. But what that actually results in terms of the actual design of the games is things that feel quite distinct. There's a leading company in Nigeria called GameSol that has over 10 million downloads of its games, and only on Windows Phone, which I didn't realize there were that many Windows phones out there, actually. So they must be doing okay. And they're a super interesting company that represents a model many other creators in Nigeria and the rest of Africa are trying to emulate. You might have heard of Nollywood, which is one of the biggest film industries outside of Hollywood. That industry makes films with low budgets and excruciatingly short timelines, but with sky-high prolificness. GameSol has a similar model, making and releasing games every single month. Over the course of 2 years since they've formally existed, they've released 50 games online. For them, it doesn't make sense to spend years on games with lots of graphics, great technology, and complex mechanics when many of their players will find it too expensive to download a large game and too hard for them to get into really complex games with meta games when they've barely ever used a cell phone before. So instead, they make these quick micro games, often with Nigerian settings and stories, as you can sort of see over here. And other people within the industry are trying to use this model. And this rapid game creation approach leads to a huge mix of games. We often see these micro games with sort of mechanical clones, but we also see some simple but wholly unique games coming out of Nigeria. The game in the top left-hand corner is table soccer, which is a digital recreation of a game Nigerian kids play with bottle caps. They play soccer with different colored bottle caps to represent it, and that's just a digital recreation of that game. Throne of Gods represents a new model for Nigeria, where creators draw from the Central African successes like Orion to create more polished and longer-term projects. This project is a mobile fighter that draws from Street Fighter, but has characters that are, again, inspired by African myth, fantasy, and legend. So now we move on to Eastern Africa, which I won't talk about too much again, because the major country with the game dev scene there is Kenya, and there's a very long, extensive article about the scene on Polygon, which you can go read. And they don't really do that much different from what I've spoken about already. Southern Africa is where I'm from, so of course that's going to be the place I'm most familiar with. There are small things happening in Zambia, Madagascar, and Uganda, but nothing too prolific for me to draw trend analysis from. South Africa is probably one of the most developed countries in Africa, so it's no surprise that there's quite a large game development scene there. And from my analysis, I think there's two main camps that and trends we can see coming out of the region. And that is the satire/pastiche camp and what I call the filthy indie punk movement. And the former is emerging out of the unique position of white South Africans. One of the largest white populations in Africa, perhaps many white South Africans don't exist in a very liminal space. They exist in Africa, which perhaps they don't feel completely accepted by. At the same time, they don't have ties to their Western heritage. They've maybe gone generations. They may not be able to access passports or citizenship anymore, and perhaps don't practice those cultural aspects in their lives anymore. Instead, they're stuck in a space and exist in a country and have no culture necessarily to call their own that is tied to the place they live. And because, perhaps in a search for meaning, white South Africans consume a lot of Western culture. But because they perhaps don't feel related to it or embedded in it, they don't simply add to it. Instead, they satirize it, poking fun at the ideas and culture of the West. All of the games on screen are made in South Africa, but read as being immersed in Western culture and are regularly confused for being made in America and elsewhere. These works are mostly pastiche, patchworks of jokes and references to many other works, using humor to lightly criticize or sometimes just create tributes to those works. And the West rewards these games by buying a lot of copies without perhaps realizing that they're being made fun of. All of the games on screen have done pretty well in terms of their numbers. A sort of sub-movement of this is mechanical parody, which is something that is starting to emerge and has a bit more of a diverse creator base. These games all parody ideas of mechanics in genres or specific things. Desktop Dungeons, for example, is probably the start of this movement and won an IGF in 2010, 2011 for design. And I think the way I read the game is it's a parody of exploration in roguelikes. It operationalizes the very idea of exploring, while there's this cricket game as well, which is, silly and wonderful. Good job, Evan. The filthy indie punk movement, as I like to call it, is a subset of part-time or hobbyist creators making excellent and wonderful anti-games that challenge established rhetoric and often stem from personal experience. They also usually reject traditional notions of beauty and polish requirements in games. From patriarchal smashing mini-games to gay dating, wrestling simulators, this movement has some of the most wondrous stuff coming out of it, and I can't wait for it to expand more in the future. Something I want to touch on, because I opened with it but didn't really fit anywhere else, is the idea of analog games in the history of Africa. For some reason that we know of, or at least that I know of, there aren't a huge number of creators making board games in Africa. They're still played all over the continent and usually in traditional formats, but often there are, and even digital remakes, but there's very little new board games coming out of it. Perhaps it feels too sacrosanct. These games are something that's part of their culture, part of their life. Why do you need to make something else? But we can only speculate. This is something I'd love to learn more about. There are a couple of creators that I do know about. In Nigeria, there's a sole developer creating many little abstract board games, and I hope to find out more about him. And then my friend Titi Chimua is from South Africa, often makes new board games. The game pictured here is called After Robot, which systematizes the minibus taxi industry in South Africa, a system that millions in the country use to travel every day. In South Africa, for some reason, traffic lights are called robots. So After Robot refers to being dropped off. It's a great game. And now, quickly, to close off, after this whirlwind tour, I just want to talk about the future. I've probably already left out countless interesting works that are happening around the continent, but we only have so much time. So the first thing I want to talk about is audience. I foresee the audience of African games growing and maturing. At the moment, mostly local players don't consume a lot of African-made games, apart from perhaps in Northern and Central Africa. Few studios survive off selling directly to African players. The most successful studios that we know of sell to the diaspora and international players. I think this audience will change and mature over time, hopefully leading to more local players consuming locally made content. I also foresee obvious African work, such as Orion, selling and doing well with international audiences. Perhaps as well, and this is more idealistic, I hope to see unique hardware solutions for African game players. We're a continent that uses mostly their phones for consuming content and interacting with the world. There must be a better way to play games and orient around phones. Using things like Air Console might be an exciting future. It's really hard to predict design trends, obviously, but I think we will start to see more creators exploring personal games as art side of things, as you see already in Northern and Southern Africa. We'll see more polished and smoother edges around games, of course, but hopefully we'll also see collaboration within Africa and between Africans and international creators as well. What I'm most excited for is the emerging of unique aesthetics and mechanics that are inspired by those unique African contexts. What I'm really excited to see is African ideas brought to life in games. Part of the reason South Africa emerged out of its apartheid transition safely is because of an idea of Ubuntu in South African culture. Nelson Mandela, warmly referred to as Madiba in South Africa, defined it as this: a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or water. Once he stops, the people give him food and attend him. This is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it was have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to improve? This is just such a powerful idea. Imagine if you made games like this, truly cooperative games about enriching each other and working together. I would love to see that. Another example of an African idea I would love to see eke its way into games coming out of the continent is this. In 2015, many countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement, the first comprehensive climate agreement in the history of the world. Previous agreements had really stalled or hadn't really got concrete agreements and solutions. So the organizers turned to a different conference structure. Zulu and Xhosa people in South Africa have long used an indaba, a type of method to settle disputes. The indaba is a public meeting where everyone has their say and the community is consulted to get their view on decisions. In addition, at an indaba, parties are only allowed to bring red lines to the table, things they cannot cross, and solutions. Those are the only things you're allowed to bring to the table at Indaba. The process of the Indaba at this conference was remarked on by many as being one of the important factors for reaching the historic agreement. African ideas, processes, and structures are immensely powerful. Games made by African creators can and will be too. There's a whole continent of stories, experiences, and unique contexts to explore. Africa is beautiful, Africa is powerful, and Africa is unique. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me in playing and falling in love with some more African games. I think we have some time for questions, if there are any. 5 minutes of questions? Anyone? No? Evan?
What was the game underneath Wrestling's Emotions?
Oh, it's very eloquently called Fuck the System. It's very subtle. It's a student game from Bahia in South Africa, Bahia Khan. Yeah, it's very cool. Any other questions? Yes? I think so. So the question is, there's already clever things in Africa like Andela, which allows you to transfer mobile money between phones that create unique solutions for African context. Do you think services will emerge that allow people to create games, play games more easily? And I think there already are. I mean, in South Africa, we already have a ton of investment from internet companies that invest in games and like esports as a way to do that. I think the mobile networks in Africa as well are doing a lot of that. I'm trying to find the slide. But that company I mentioned, GameSol, they work quite regularly with MTN, which is a big cell phone network around Africa, to make storefronts specifically for games and sell directly with MTN's store. So I think it is happening. Not sure if it's directly for games, but creators are trying to find more creative ways around it, definitely. That's kind of one of the problems, is it's hard to sell directly to local consumers, so you can't really blame local players for not playing local stuff too much. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much.